David here from Another Eden Adventures. How you doing? You've probably seen all the latest hype about Dewey Alter, or you're playing or just about to play the latest Mythos update, where you get to see the incredibly emo, incredibly broken version of Dewey. Man, that dude's been through some tough time. He kind of looks like what the love child between the lead singer of The Cure and Edward Scissorhands would look like, don't you think? Before you get into Dewey Alter, it's useful to know the backstory of the original Dewey. The young lad who puffs steam whenever he sees a pretty nurse. Even if he looks and behaves like a typical family-friendly child superhero, he has a pretty dark origin story.
How about it? Dewey's the name. Call me whenever you're in a pinch.
So here it is. Once again, don't forget to like and subscribe, because the more likes I get, the more nails I'll paint black.
If you need me to fight, I'll fight. I'm just fuel for the fires. My life means nothing. Use it as you wish.
Thank you for your support. Introduced in October 2019 as a water-based unit, Dewey OG, or Original Dewey, unlike Dewey Alter, is a happy-go-lucky boy and looks pretty much like a replica of Sora from Kingdom Hearts. Belonging to the future Miglena continent, Dewey's story starts in Elzion. We get a deeper dive into Dewey's true story during his second side quest. In this side quest, we find out there's a man in a coma being held in Elzimed Hospital, which seems to trigger something in Dewey. Dewey and Aldo rush to the airport to investigate. Here, they encounter some synth humans about to attack some doctors and a nurse. They rescue them, and it turns out the nurse knows Dewey. We find out that she was Dewey's nurse when he was a patient at the hospital where he spent a part of his childhood. Mysterious. After a comical scene where Dewey blows off some steam, the nurse brings Aldo and Dewey back to the hospital. We find out there are numerous people who are comatose and the doctors don't know what to do. So instead of getting help from other medical professionals in their field, they turn to the teenagers Aldo and Dewey for help. Aldo and Dewey investigate the industrial ruins and take down some Sith humans to find a toxin that could potentially save the comatose people. They win, get the toxin, and as they're about to leave, they encounter a clearly sinister looking mad scientist dude who is clearly a bad guy. But Dewey believes the professor is a fantastic mate of his, and explains to Aldo that the professor's work helped save him and a bunch of kids back when he was sick in hospital when he was young. On the way back, Dewey tells the professor about his journey, and the professor observes how the nanotech is evolving. The professor, who really looks suspicious, and I'm calling it now, he's a bad dude, conveniently then gives Dewey a serum to alleviate the symptoms of everyone in the coma. And apparently he made the serum on their way back. Come on, man. Dewey and Aldo give the serum invented by an unknown, uncredited mad professor to the doctors, who gladly then take it and immediately proceed to inject everyone who's in a coma. I personally think that's a massive gamble, but hey, it works and everyone once again lives happily ever after. Or do they? Certainly not Dewey. We find out that the nurse that Dewey rescued and who made him blow steam love hearts from his body was actually engaged to the first and last love of her life. And the cue Dewey gave helped rescue her fiancé. So thanks to Dewey, they're going to get married. And at the end of this heartbreaking tale, we see a very confession from Dewey, who says she is the love of his life. But will Dewey ever find happiness? We shall see. After the sad Dewey scene, it seems, and I totally called it, the professor is more sinister than Dewey thinks and calls Dewey his precious lab rat. Come on, man. No good, genuine person calls another person a precious lab rat. Chapter 3 is where things get really interesting for Dewey, and where things tie into the latest Mythos update. Chapter 3, titled "What's the Probability of That?", starts with Aldo and Dewey bumping into the administrator, who conveniently brings up the professor. He says the professor hasn't renewed his ID and has been deemed a missing person. He then tells Dewey and Aldo that the professor used to work for the giant corporation KMS, which is kind of like Another Eden's version of the Umbrella Corporation. Apparently there were once 7 research institutions under the KMS umbrella working on exploring the possibilities of the human body, whatever that means, right? Among those labs, one burned to the ground and another was destroyed in an incident involving the personnel there. So the rest were forced to close. So something sketchy was clearly going on. Supposedly, the professor was a spokesperson for one of these labs. The ambassador then hints that there was something off about the professor, which I totally called, and I keep calling now. Dewey, however, is forever defensive of the professor, and what do you have it? Just like a sitcom, the professor magically appears. The professor asks Dewey to meet a girl, and Aldo is like, sure, I'll come along. The professor introduces them to a little girl who only has a few days remaining. And Dewey talks about how he grew up knowing many other kids who died the same way. The professor says in order to save this girl, all he needs from Dewey is a little blood. That's it. You can trust me. They venture to Xeno Domain for treatment. Dewey goes into the pod to get some blood taken, and the professor transmits the nanotech from his blood sample into the girl's. But guess what? It doesn't work, and the girl collapses. The professor then confesses there is only a tiny chance of saving her, and Aldo does that squirming face thing he does and gets all grumpy. But then the professor counters the girl was going to die anyway, so they might as well have tried something new. The professor then says every child in the hospital Dewey grew up in all received nanotech like he did, but only Dewey survived. The truth was the kids were never discharged. They died. Aldo confronts the professor, but the professor traps Aldo in a bind, saying he will continue to use the girl for research. Dewey tries to use his finger blaster to fire down the professor, but he shoots blanks. And remember this for the Mythos update, everyone. The professor says he's always had full control of Dewey's nanotech, and that without his permission, Dewey won't be able to fire a single wisp of steam. The professor escapes with the girl, but Aldo and Dewey don't give up and they track the professor down. Dewey says a passionate speech and he literally becomes a Super Saiyan. He manages to use his steam power without the professor's consent, making the professor even happier for some reason. The professor confesses his only goal throughout this whole ordeal was to push Dewey to his limits. The whole thing was all about Dewey all along. Kind of like an evil mentor and an innocent assassin relationship you see in movies. As Dewey gives the girl a pep talk, their nanotech shines, and all of a sudden, she's cured. Like with most side quests, Aldo says this whole thing has been confusing, so he makes some reason about the nanotech evolving, and Dewey, as innocent as he is, says, yeah, that makes sense, I guess. So there you have it. In summary, Dewey was part of a mass experiment of children and nanotech conducted by KMS and a crazy professor, and he was the lone survivor of it all. As Dewey trudges on with life, so does his nanotech and the abilities they give him. This version of Dewey, although coming from a dark place, has emerged a happy, helpful Dewey, which is way different from the Dewey from the parallel worlds in the Mythos update.
What? What is this place? Have I finally reached the gates of hell?
I have a full playthrough of this, by the way. I've linked them below. Here you'll be able to see what I'm talking about and also understand Dewey Alter's tragic future. What do you think about Dewey? Let me know in the comments below, and thanks again for liking and subscribing. These videos take a lot of hours to make, so your support really helps. Happy gaming, everyone.